I still remember the moment the footage froze on my laptop screen, the grainy night vision glow, catching two figures in HOA branded polos, walking up my brother Mark's porch like they owned the place. It was almost 3 in the morning. The entire neighborhood was asleep, unaware that a crime was unfolding right under their noses. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding as one of the men looked around, flicked off the porch light, and grabbed Mark's wheelchair like it was nothing more than a piece of junk. They didn't hesitate. They didn't knock. They didn't leave a note. They simply lifted the chair, carried it to their truck, and drove away as quietly as they had arrived. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Anger swelled in me so fast my hands shook. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. And it definitely wasn't legal. Whoever these men were, they had planned this. They waited until the dead of night. They wanted to make sure Mark couldn't stop them. They wanted to make sure no one saw. But I had seen everything. I walked outside to Mark's porch, needing to see it with my own eyes. The space where his wheelchair had been was painfully empty. The air felt colder, sharper, as if the house itself had been violated. A violation notice was still taped to the door, the same bright red letter we had found earlier that morning. I tore it off the frame and read it again, even though I already knew every word. Large black letters stared back at me. Unauthorized medical equipment in public view. Immediate fine. $1,000. I remembered the call we made to the HOA right after finding the letter. I could still hear the HOA president's voice, Linda Holloway, dripping with arrogance as she explained their new aesthetic guidelines. According to her, wheelchairs, walkers, and other mobility devices created a cheap and unwelcoming visual environment. She said it so casually, as if stripping someone of their dignity was just another box she checked on her daily list. I had argued, demanded an explanation, tried to make her understand, but she didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge Mark as a human being. All she said was, "Rules apply to everyone. If an item violates neighborhood standards, it must be removed." I never imagined she meant literally removed. When I helped Mark into his old backup wheelchair earlier that day, the pain in his face said more than his words ever could. The older chair was rigid, uncomfortable, and barely fit him after years of wear. Watching him struggle to adjust the armrests, gripping the cold metal edges, something inside me cracked. This wasn't just about a stolen wheelchair. This was about humiliation. This was about erasing him from a neighborhood he had every right to call home. The more I thought about Linda's tone, the more it gnawed at me. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she couldn't be touched. Someone who thought her position gave her power over us. But standing on that porch, staring at the empty space where Mark's wheelchair should have been, I felt something shift inside me. Something sharp, something determined. Because the truth was, Linda had made a mistake. A mistake so big she couldn't possibly understand it yet. They had no idea the man they targeted wasn't just a guy in a wheelchair, and they were about to find out the hard way. I still remember the sharp chemical smell of the ink when I unfolded that bright red violation letter for the first time. It was the morning before the wheelchair was stolen, long before I knew how far the HOA would go. But even then, the paper felt hostile in my hands. The envelope had been slapped onto Mark's front door like a scarlet warning, the kind meant to shame rather than inform. As I pulled the paper open, the bold black text practically jumped off the page. Unauthorized medical equipment visible from public walkway. Immediate fine. $1,000. Compliance required within 24 hours. My hands trembled as I held it, not from fear, but from a rising anger that seemed to pulse through my fingertips. The words didn't feel real. A wheelchair? A medical device? Something my brother needed just to live his daily life? It felt impossible that anyone, especially the people supposedly managing our community, could consider that a violation. Yet the letter was real. The fine was real. The threat was real. When I told Mark, he didn't react the way I expected. He took the letter from me quietly, reading each line with a calmness that felt unnatural. His jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He simply exhaled, long and slow, and said, "They're escalating." "Escalating? Mark, they just fined you $1,000 for owning a wheelchair." I snapped, pacing across the living room. "That's not escalating. That's a declaration." He didn't answer, and that only made the fury inside me rise again. I called the HOA immediately, fully prepared to demand answers. What I wasn't prepared for was the voice that greeted me, polished, cold, and dripping with a kind of professional cruelty. It was Linda Holloway, the HOA president herself. "Yes, Mr. Walker," she said, her tone so smooth it made my skin crawl. "Wheelchairs, walkers, and other mobility devices reduce property value and disrupt the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. Our new guidelines are very clear." I felt my grip tighten on the phone until my knuckles went white. "You're telling me that a disabled man's mobility device makes your neighborhood look cheap?" "We enforce the same rules for everyone," she replied, not even hesitating. "If an item violates community standards, it must be removed." Removed. That word hit me like a slap. Even then, before they stole it, before the cameras caught them sneaking onto Mark's porch at night, I should have known what she meant. But denial is powerful. You want to believe people can't be that heartless. You want to believe rules have limits. You want to believe discrimination isn't hiding behind every polite smile. But the truth was undeniable. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was targeted, personal, cruel, and illegal. I remembered something from a training seminar at work. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodations in housing. HOAs can enforce rules, sure, but they cannot discriminate against someone for having a mobility device. What Linda was doing wasn't just morally wrong. It was a violation of federal law. As this realization settled over me, fear mixed with fury. What if they kept targeting him? What if this was just the beginning? What if the HOA had decided Mark didn't belong here? I looked at my brother, still calm, still unreadable, and felt frustration twist inside me. "Why aren't you more upset?" I demanded. "Why aren't you fighting back?" He finally looked up, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. And that's when Mark finally told me who he really was. I stared at Mark, completely stunned, as he leaned back in his old creaking wheelchair and said it as casually as if he were telling me what he wanted for lunch. "I wasn't just some analyst," he said quietly. "I spent 15 years in federal intelligence, counterterrorism, asset tracking, internal corruption investigations, the kind of work where you learn exactly how to find people who think they can't be found." For a moment, I just stood there, the violation letter still crumpled in my fist. I had known Mark had worked for the government. I knew he'd been injured in a car crash years ago that ended his field career. But I didn't know this. I didn't know he carried the kind of authority that made entire agencies sit up straight. I didn't know he had spent years dismantling networks run by people far more dangerous than any HOA president. He turned his laptop toward me, fingers moving with the kind of speed and confidence that comes from muscle memory built over thousands of investigations. "HOAs handle millions of dollars," he said. "And someone like Linda doesn't pull a stunt this bold unless she's used to no one pushing back. That means there's more underneath." Within minutes, he had pulled up the HOA's annual financial reports, documents most homeowners never bother to read, buried on page 12 of their website. He clicked through them with an expression I hadn't seen before. Part curiosity, part irritation, part professional focus. "Landscaping," he muttered. "They spent over $80,000 last year on landscaping for a neighborhood with 6 small parks and a single lawn contractor. That's inflated. At least double." He opened another tab. "Maintenance, repairs, special assessments." Every category, every receipt, every invoice told the same story. Overpriced services, unexplained expenses, vague descriptions written just professionally enough to look legitimate to someone who didn't know what to look for. But Mark knew. He scrolled further, leaning in closer. "Here it is," he whispered. "Transactions marked as special maintenance fund. Thousands at a time. Multiple transfers. All cash withdrawals. He tapped the screen with his finger. No receipts, no contractor signatures, no explanations. It hit me then just how serious this was. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't a misfiled report. This was deliberate, and whoever was behind it wasn't even trying that hard to hide it. That's when Mark opened a spreadsheet he had created in seconds, cross-referencing all the withdrawals, all the fees, all the assessments the homeowners had been charged over the past 3 years. A number appeared at the bottom of the screen. $197,482. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. This can't be real, I whispered. It's real, Mark said, and it's embezzlement. I stood behind him, my throat tightening with something I couldn't even name. Rage? Shock? A sense of betrayal so deep it felt personal? I had lived in this neighborhood for years. I had trusted these people. All of us had. But they were bleeding us dry. Mark wasn't done. He opened one more document, an HOA bylaws file that most residents never even bothered to open. HOAs are legally required to maintain accurate financial records, he said. It's part of fiduciary duty. Homeowners have the right to request and review those records at any time under state transparency laws. If they're hiding this, they know it's illegal. I swallowed hard, watching him piece together a puzzle I never even knew existed. He was calm, composed, almost surgical in his precision. Meanwhile, my pulse wouldn't slow. This isn't just petty abuse of authority, I said quietly. Mark looked up at me, his expression sharpening. This wasn't just abuse of power. This was criminal. The community center was already overflowing when I pushed the door open. A thick wave of heated voices rolling over me as every chair filled the moment it was set out. I stepped inside clutching a folder packed with printed evidence, screenshots of the wheelchair theft, financial reports, bank statements Mark had pulled, everything we needed for what was about to happen. The air felt heavy, tense, buzzing with the kind of anticipation that makes everyone sit up straighter without knowing why. Conversations died as I walked down the aisle. Eyes followed me. People sensed something was coming. Linda Holloway stood at the front, perfectly positioned under the fluorescent lights like it was her personal stage. Her blonde hair was styled, her blazer crisp, her confidence radiating through the room as she lectured the homeowners about neighborhood standards. Her voice was smooth, practiced, every word delivered with the self-assuredness of someone who believed she was untouchable. She had no idea what was about to hit her. "We expect all residents to comply," she said, lifting her chin. "We can't have disorder, or the neighborhood declines. That is why our enforcement has become firmer." Firmer. The word made my jaw tighten. Before she could move on, I stepped forward. "I have something to address." A ripple moved through the room. Linda paused, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Sir, homeowner concerns come at the end. You'll have your turn." "Oh, trust me," I said, raising the folder. "You'll want to hear this now." I walked to the front, pulled out a printed photo, and laid it on the table in front of her. It was a still frame from the security footage. The exact moment her contractors lifted Mark's wheelchair off his porch. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the old ceiling fan cutting through the air. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is footage of 2 HOA employees stealing a disabled man's wheelchair in the middle of the night." Gasps rippled through the audience like a shockwave. People leaned forward. A woman near the front covered her mouth. A man muttered something I couldn't quite hear, but the anger in his voice was unmistakable. Linda's expression barely shifted, but her eyes flickered just for a second. "If a non-compliant item is left in public view," she said stiffly, "the HOA has the right to remove it." "Remove it?" I shot back. "You stole a medical device. This isn't landscaping. This is mobility. This is someone's ability to get out of bed, go to the doctor, live his life." Before she could answer, Mark wheeled forward, placing his own stack of papers on the table. His calmness sliced through the tension like a blade. "This isn't the only crime being committed here," he said. "Your financial reports show nearly $200,000 withdrawn from the HOA account with no receipts, No explanation, no authorization. The room erupted again, but this time it wasn't gasps. It was outrage. 200,000? Where did it go? Is this true? You lied to us. Greg, the wiry board member with nervous eyes, looked like he was about to faint. His hands shook as he flipped through the papers, his face draining of color. Linda, you said everything was compliant, he whispered. Sit down, Greg, she snapped, her voice cracking for the first time all evening. But it was too late. The crowd was already turning. Homeowners stood up, pointing, demanding answers. The board tried to regain control, but the panic spread through them like smoke. And Linda, finally, looked afraid. Because by the time the meeting ended, Linda knew she wasn't safe anymore. I watched Mark's finger hover over the trackpad for a moment, the faint glow of the laptop screen lighting his face. The room was quiet, too quiet, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. Then with a single tap, he hit send. The first federal complaint email was gone, fired straight into the inbox of a fraud specialist who owed Mark more than one favor from his intelligence days. And just like that, the storm began. But before the chaos hit, there was a strange calm that settled over the house. Mark leaned back, letting out a slow breath, and the soft hum of his computer filled the silence. It felt like standing on the beach seconds before the wind changes. When the air goes still, the sky darkens, and you realize something massive is about to crash through your life. It's done, he said quietly. What happens now? I asked. He looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. We wait about an hour, and then everything they've built starts to collapse. The collapse started faster than I expected. The State Department overseeing homeowner associations sent a preliminary notice. Exactly the type Mark knew would trigger an automatic response. As soon as the email hit the HOA inbox, their financial accounts were flagged for a forensic audit. That meant everything the board touched. Bank statements, receipts, transfers would be pulled apart piece by people trained to find every missing dollar. A forensic audit isn't gentle. It doesn't ask politely. It digs hard. It freezes assets. It demands documentation. It exposes every secret, every dollar misused, every lie neatly buried under community improvements. Most HOAs barely survive the process. Corrupt ones don't survive at all. Within minutes, panic unfolded in real time. Mark pulled up the live camera feed from the small business complex where the HOA kept their office. On the screen, I watched as Linda's silver sedan screeched into the parking lot so fast the tires skipped. She ran inside without closing her door. Greg arrived next, fumbling with his keys as if the world were ending. Two other board members hurried in behind him, their faces tight with fear. None of them knew they were being watched. Mark smirked. They're trying to cover their tracks. But they can't, right? No, he said. The audit already froze their accounts. They're too late. And then something unexpected happened. Something that made everything feel bigger than just us. Neighbors started knocking on Mark's door. First, it was the elderly couple from across the street, carrying a folder full of unexplained fines. Then a young mom with a stack of warnings she never understood. Then a man who had been threatened with foreclosure over a fence the HOA approved years earlier. Each person had a story, some small, some devastating, all pointing to the same truth. This HOA had been abusing its power for a long time. I wrote down every detail while Mark organized the documents into categories: financial misconduct, harassment, fraud, ADA violations. He knew exactly what investigators needed. With each new testimony, the picture grew clearer. This wasn't mismanagement. It was systematic exploitation. By late afternoon, Mark had enough evidence to bury every board member twice over. He sent a second email, attaching everything. He made another call to a contact in financial crimes. He updated the federal case file, and then he paused, turning slightly toward the window. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I heard it first. The low, Unmistakable rumble of engines. When I stepped outside and looked down the street, I saw them. 3 black SUVs rolling slowly into our neighborhood, and then the black SUVs rolled into our neighborhood. The sight of Linda Holloway being led out of the HOA office in handcuffs is something I will never forget. The agents had her by each arm, guiding her down the walkway as her heels scraped against the concrete. Her perfect hair was tangled, her blazer wrinkled, and the confidence she always carried like armor had completely evaporated. For the first time, Linda didn't look like the queen of the neighborhood. She looked like what she was: a criminal finally getting caught. Neighbors began stepping out onto their porches one by one, drawn by the flashing lights and the dark SUVs lining the street. A few whispered to each other. Some gasped in disbelief. Others didn't bother hiding their satisfaction. After everything she'd done, the fines, the harassment, the stolen wheelchair, the neighborhood deserved this moment. I stood beside Mark at the edge of the driveway. He watched in silence, but the slight lift at the corner of his mouth told me everything. Linda tried to twist away from the agents, shouting something about needing her lawyer, about misunderstandings, about how she never authorized anything. But the agents didn't respond. They simply read her rights and placed her in the back of the SUV with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times. As soon as the car door shut behind her, the rest of the HOA board members began unraveling. They had gathered near the office entrance when the agents first arrived, forming a pathetic cluster of pale faces and shaking hands. Greg looked like he might faint. Another board member kept wiping sweat from his neck, eyes darting from one agent to another. The moment Linda was gone, they seemed to lose whatever backbone they had left. The first resignation email went out 20 minutes later, then another, and another. By the end of the afternoon, the entire board had either quit or gone completely silent, hoping if they hid long enough the federal spotlight might pass over them. They were wrong. The audit Mark triggered earlier had escalated. The IRS now had access to the financial reports, and the moment they saw the cash withdrawals and missing funds, they launched their own investigation. That meant every dollar these board members touched would be tracked, every transaction analyzed, every community improvement scrutinized. For people who thought they were clever enough to steal from homeowners, this was the nightmare scenario. The street grew louder as reporters arrived. News vans lined the curb. Camera crews jogged from house to house, interviewing neighbors who had been living in fear for years. Microphones popped up in every direction as journalists asked questions about corruption, theft, harassment, and discrimination. A reporter even approached me, asking what sparked the investigation. I didn't give details, not yet, but I did tell her one thing. Someone finally decided to stand up. The mood in the neighborhood shifted. People who once avoided eye contact now gathered in small groups, sharing their stories openly. Some were relieved, some were angry, some were simply stunned that the HOA, once an unshakable source of intimidation, had collapsed so fast. Joy mixed with disbelief, hope mixed with caution. After so many years of being controlled by a board that thrived on fear, the community didn't know whether to celebrate or brace for whatever came next. Mark rolled up beside me, watching the chaos unfold. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. I didn't know what he meant at the time. Not until later, because while most of the board had run from the fallout, one of them wasn't ready to go quietly. The email arrived long after the agents had taken Linda away, long after the sun had set and the news vans had cleared the street. I was sitting at Mark's kitchen table, sorting through homeowner statements, when my phone buzzed with a notification. At first I thought it was another neighbor reaching out. But when I opened the message, a cold pressure tightened in my chest. There was no greeting, no signature, no explanation, just one line. "Walk away before things get worse." I stared at the screen, rereading the words as a slow creeping anger rose inside me. I'd dealt with arrogant HOA board members, fake fines, and smug threats before. But this was different. This was personal. This was cornered animal desperation. I turned the phone toward Mark. He didn't flinch. "Forward it to me." I did. and he immediately transferred the message to one of his encrypted forensic tracing tools. The laptop screen reflected in his focused eyes as code scrolled rapidly down the monitor. He didn't speak while he worked. He didn't need to. I'd already seen enough to know that Mark in investigation mode was someone most criminals would never want to meet. This sender's sloppy, he muttered. Didn't mask their network. Didn't use a tunnel. Amateurs always get cocky when they panic. I swallowed, watching him bypass digital walls I didn't even understand. With every passing second, my anger sharpened. After everything they'd done, after the theft, the fines, the harassment, the arrest, they still thought intimidation could silence us. A final line of code flashed green. Mark sat back and turned the screen toward me. The sender wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a troll. It wasn't some random neighbor scared about the fallout. It was Greg, the HOA treasurer who had sat trembling at the meeting, the man who had pretended to be clueless while approving every suspicious withdrawal. The calm that washed over Mark was far more dangerous than anger. He just made a mistake, Mark said quietly. A big one. Sending the threat? I asked. No, Mark replied, tapping the screen. Sending the threat digitally. That's obstruction of justice. Federal obstruction is no joke, and now we have proof. The words hit me like a cold gust. A legal nugget Mark once mentioned came back to me. Once a federal investigation begins, any attempt to interfere, destroy documents, send threats, hide evidence, becomes a felony. Greg hadn't just panicked. He had incriminated himself. Mark pulled up Greg's financial records next, something he had only skimmed before. Now he dug deeper, faster, and what he found made my stomach twist. Hidden payments from shell companies, off-the-books HOA expenses, fake vendor invoices, unreported deposits that didn't match his salary. This isn't small time, Mark said, scrolling through another line of transactions. Greg was laundering money. He wasn't just part of the fraud, he was running a big piece of it. The realization hit me. Greg wasn't weak. He wasn't clueless. He'd been pretending, using Linda as a shield while he quietly funneled money through the HOA. And now he's threatening us? I muttered. Mark closed the laptop with a quiet final tap. He thinks fear will make us drop the investigation. He doesn't know who he's dealing with. I felt something shift inside me. Not fear. Not hesitation. Something stronger. Resolve. Greg had crossed a line, and we weren't backing down. Mark turned to me, his voice calm, almost steady. We're going to his house next. Greg opened the door before we even knocked twice. His hand was shaking so violently the doorknob rattled against the frame. His eyes darted from me to Mark, then to the street behind us, as if he expected federal agents to appear out of thin air. Fear poured off him in waves. He looked nothing like the timid board member who sat silently beside Linda during the HOA meetings. This Greg was cornered, pale, sweating, and very aware that his world was collapsing. You shouldn't be here, he stammered, attempting to push the door shut. Mark rolled forward, wedging the footrest of his wheelchair between the door and the frame. Greg, he said, calm but firm. You sent a threat. Now you answer for it. Greg froze. His eyes widened as he realized that every option he'd counted on, silence, hiding, intimidation, had evaporated. Slowly, he stepped back, allowing us inside. The moment we crossed the threshold, I understood exactly where the missing HOA money had been going. Greg's house looked like something out of a luxury catalog. A brand new driveway, fresh paint on the walls, high-end recessed lighting, new leather furniture that still smelled like the factory, gleaming kitchen countertops, imported tile, landscaping out front that easily cost more than most families spend in an entire year. All of it recently installed, all of it far too extravagant for a man living on a modest HOA stipend and a mid-level salary. You've been busy, I said quietly, scanning the room. Greg flinched. Mark didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone, clicked record, and placed it on the kitchen island between them. We're going to do this once, he said. And you're going to tell the truth, because what's coming for you is a lot worse than us. Greg sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. I didn't mean for it to get this far, he whispered. I never thought it would fall apart. It fell apart the moment you stole from homeowners. I shot back. And the moment you threatened us. He winced, the guilt and fear intertwining in his expression. Mark leaned forward. Start talking. And Greg did. It didn't happen all at once. At first he tried to dodge, offering half excuses and vague details. But every time he hesitated, Mark countered with a piece of evidence he had already uncovered. Bank transfers, shell company names, signature mismatches. Greg cracked under that pressure faster than I even expected. Then the truth came out. There were more people involved. A real estate investor group working behind the scenes, buying homes that the HOA foreclosed on through manufactured violations. A property appraiser who intentionally undervalued homes to make the flips more profitable. And worst of all, a city official who approved zoning adjustments and construction permits in exchange for kickback money. Greg had been the treasurer, the one funneling HOA funds out of sight, using fake invoices and staged maintenance projects to hide the transfers. Linda was the face of the operation, enforcing aggressive fines and threats to force homeowners into compliance or foreclosure. But Greg was the accountant for the entire scheme. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Greg whispered. They told me it was easy money, that no one checks HOA accounts, that homeowners are too scared or too busy to question anything. He stopped, the words choking out. Mark didn't look away. You helped ruin lives. Greg nodded, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. I know. We recorded every word, every detail, every name. And when Greg finished his confession, when he finally leaned back in his chair looking hollow and defeated, I realized something that sent a chill through me. What Greg told us made the wheelchair theft look like nothing. The first siren echoed through the neighborhood just as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in muted streaks of orange and gray. I stepped onto Mark's porch and froze. Police units were flooding the street. Cruisers, unmarked sedans, and a mobile evidence van. Their lights flashed silently, casting sharp reflections across windows and driveways. Then I saw them, officers in tactical jackets converging on the HOA office at the end of the block. The raids had begun. Mark wheeled up beside me, his expression unreadable but focused. Right on schedule, he murmured. We watched as officers approached the office door, announced themselves, and entered. Moments later, 2 detectives emerged carrying boxes stuffed with hard drives, file binders, and computers wrapped in evidence bags. Another officer hauled out a stack of labeled folders, the kind the HOA had always insisted homeowners were not authorized to view. The truth was finally out in the daylight. Across the street, neighbors whispered to each other, clutching coffee mugs, shaking their heads, pointing at the scene unfolding like a crime documentary come to life. For years, the HOA office had been a place of fear, where fines were issued, threats were typed, and power was abused. Now it was being emptied piece by piece under police supervision. This is only the first location, Mark said, checking his phone. He was right. Minutes later, additional units peeled away and headed in different directions throughout the neighborhood. One stopped at a small stucco house where the corrupted appraiser lived. Another turned down Birch Lane toward the city official's property, the same official who approved zoning exceptions that allowed the investor group to flip homes illegally. Officers went door to door with sealed warrants in hand. Neighbors watched from their lawns, jaws clenched in a mixture of shock and satisfaction. Every name Greg had given us was on the list. By mid-morning, the case was already in the hands of the county prosecutor, backed by a mountain of evidence Mark had organized with the precision of a seasoned investigator. The prosecutor, an older man known for taking on public corruption cases, reviewed the files personally, and when he stepped in front of the cameras during a brief press update, he didn't mince words. This is one of the most extensive HOA fraud schemes our office has ever encountered, he said. It involved organized financial misconduct, intimidation, abuse of power, and coordinated efforts to strip homeowners of their rights. It didn't take long for the legal hammer to fall. By noon, the HOA was officially dissolved under emergency court intervention. A judge appointed a neutral receiver to take control of the remaining funds, oversee refunds, secure records, and stabilize the chaos left behind by Linda and her board. Homeowners, finally free from the oppressive rule that had governed their daily lives, began celebrating. In small bursts, families gathered in front yards, some laughing, some hugging, some wiping tears they didn't bother hiding. For the first time in years, people walked through the neighborhood without glancing over their shoulders, without wondering what violation would show up next, without fearing their own community. One neighbor, Mrs. Clark, approached Mark with a trembling smile. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she said. "Thank you for all of this." Mark only nodded, but I saw the way his shoulders eased just slightly. It was the closest thing to pride I'd seen in a long time. It felt like victory. But that feeling didn't last. Because just when we thought the worst was behind us, my phone rang, and on the other end was a lawyer with a case that dwarfed everything we had seen. The lawyer's voice came through the phone, steady but urgent, the kind of tone that tells you whatever you're about to hear isn't just bad. It's bigger than anything you've dealt with before. "I have a client," he said. An elderly woman, 78 years old. She lost her home last month to a fraudulent HOA foreclosure. They manufactured violations, stacked fines, and forced her out. She's been living in a motel for 3 weeks. I felt the air leave my lungs. After everything we had uncovered in our own neighborhood, I didn't think I could still be shocked. But I was. "How is that even possible?" I asked. The lawyer hesitated. "Because the HOA isn't local. It's controlled by a management company called Neighborhood Solutions LLC, and they've been running this scam across multiple states." Mark, sitting across from me, immediately straightened in his wheelchair. His eyes sharpened, focused in an instant. "What's the pattern?" he asked. The lawyer continued. "The same formula every time. False violation notices, inflated assessments, emergency repair fees that never happen, and then foreclosure threats. When homeowners can't pay, the HOA seizes the house, sells it to a shell company, and pockets the difference. They've done this to dozens, maybe hundreds. Hundreds. The word hung in the air like a weight. After everything we'd seen, after watching officers raid homes and seize evidence, after watching an entire HOA collapse under its own corruption, I thought we had witnessed the worst of it. But now, it was becoming painfully clear. What happened to us wasn't an isolated case. It was a symptom of something much larger. Mark didn't waste a second. He opened his laptop and began typing. "Neighborhood Solutions LLC, he repeated. "Let's see what they're hiding." It didn't take long. Within minutes, he pulled up corporate filings, tax documents, and property transfers tied to the company. Page after page of patterns identical to what we'd seen. Rapid foreclosures, artificially low appraisals, emergency assessments with no corresponding contractor records. It was the same scheme, just bigger, more organized, and backed by a network of attorneys and shell corporations designed to bury homeowners in paperwork until they gave up. "These aren't small-time scammers," Mark muttered. "This is coordinated, systemic, and illegal," I added. "Dead illegal." I remembered one of the legal nuggets Mark had mentioned months earlier when helping a neighbor with a minor dispute. HOAs cannot foreclose without following strict state guidelines. They must provide clear evidence of violations, legitimate accounting records, and reasonable payment options. Anything else, forced foreclosure, fabricated violations, financial manipulation, is a violation of housing law and, in many states, outright mortgage fraud. Neighborhood Solutions had ignored every one of those rules, and they had gotten away with it because they operated under the radar, hiding behind the illusion of property management, while exploiting the most vulnerable, the elderly, the disabled, the financially struggling. Mark turned the laptop around so I could see the growing list of victims. "This isn't a neighborhood problem anymore," he said. "This is a corporate cartel. I exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me again. The same feeling I'd had the moment I watched the footage of Mark's wheelchair being stolen. A mix of outrage, disbelief, and determination. "So what do we do?" I asked. Mark's answer was immediate. "We exposed them, the same way we exposed our HOA." For the first time, I realized something important. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were choosing to fight. The lawyers sent over documents. Victims began emailing us. The trail widened, and as we dug deeper, uncovering a network of power, money, and manipulation, one truth became impossible to ignore. We had taken down one monster, but the biggest monster was still hiding. The raid on Clearwater Property Management began the same way the one in our neighborhood had, with unmarked federal vehicles rolling up at dawn, their engines low and deliberate, their windows dark enough to reflect the rising sun. But this time, it wasn't just a few agents and local officers, it was the Department of Justice. Full suits, full authority, and a full-scale operation against one of the most powerful HOA management corporations in the region. I stood beside Mark as news alerts exploded across our phones. Helicopter footage showed agents storming Clearwater's headquarters, seizing boxes of documents, servers wrapped in evidence bags, and entire filing cabinets loaded into trucks. Reporters scrambled to keep up as the office doors were forced open and employees were escorted out one by one, some crying, some silent, some trying to hide their faces. Clearwater had been built on a lie that unraveled the moment Mark connected Neighborhood Solutions to its sister corporations. Clearwater wasn't just managing communities, they were fabricating emergency assessments across dozens of HOAs. Fake roof repairs, fake plumbing replacements, fake electrical hazards. They billed homeowners thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, for work that never happened. When residents refused to pay, they were hit with liens and fast-tracked foreclosures. It was fraud wrapped in legal language, theft disguised as community improvement. But the DOJ wasn't there because of the assessments alone. They were there because of Vaugh. Richard Vaugh, the CEO of Clearwater Property Management, ran everything. He wasn't some clueless executive. He was the architect, the mastermind, and as federal investigators dug through the seized files, a new layer of corruption surfaced. Vaugh had been bribing local officials for years. Zoning approvals, permit shortcuts, administrative delays. Anything that made a foreclosure or home seizure easier, Vaugh bought it. He used envelopes stuffed with cash, offshore accounts, and luxury consulting gifts to keep his network loyal. When the FBI showed up at Vaugh's office, they found his desk empty, his car gone, his computer wiped. Vaugh had run. Mark was the first to figure out where. He booked a private jet under an alias. Mark said, typing rapidly across his laptop. Cayman Islands. He's trying to disappear before the indictments hit. How do you even find that? I asked, watching flight logs appear across the screen. Mark didn't look up. Old skills. He forwarded the flight information to the DOJ contact he'd been coordinating with. Within minutes, federal agents were rushing toward the airport. We watched the live news feed as Vaugh arrived at the terminal, rolling a suitcase behind him, wearing sunglasses like he was stepping onto a vacation instead of fleeing a criminal investigation. He tried to board. Agents intercepted him. The moment they identified themselves, his shoulders slumped and the suitcase slipped from his hand. Richard Vaugh, multi-millionaire CEO and architect of one of the largest HOA corruption schemes in the country, was arrested on the spot. Hours later, prosecutors announced charges: racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, bribery, tax evasion, and wrongful foreclosure practices affecting countless families. But something else happened too. For the first time in decades, state lawmakers stepped in. The scandal sparked hearings, debates, and public pressure so intense that new legislation began taking shape. Laws to limit HOA foreclosure power, to require financial transparency, to impose strict audits on property management companies, and to protect elderly and disabled homeowners from predatory enforcement. It felt like victory, A bigger victory than we had ever imagined when this started with a single stolen wheelchair. And yet, even as the raids continued, even as Va was processed into federal custody, even as communities across the state celebrated, I couldn't ignore the quiet question forming in the back of my mind. Mark must have felt it too. I saw it in the way he stared out the window that night, the glow of his laptop reflecting in his eyes. So much had fallen. So many had been exposed. But after everything, were we finally done? I was sitting in Mark's living room the night everything finally settled, the glow of his laptop lighting the wall behind him. On the screen was a map of the United States covered in red markers, each one a complaint, a plea, or a story sent from homeowners across the country. Some were small communities, some were massive developments, some were managed by the very corporations we had helped expose. But they all had one thing in common. People were suffering, and no one had listened until now. It felt surreal to think this all started because two HOA contractors stole my brother's wheelchair. One criminal act in the dark had exposed an entire network of greed and corruption stretching far beyond our town. But for the first time, I felt something different rising beneath the exhaustion. Hope. Our neighborhood had changed. Completely. The court-appointed receiver worked faster than anyone expected. Refund checks went out to every homeowner who had been wrongfully fined. Stolen funds were returned. Blocks that had lived under fear for years were suddenly free. People walked their dogs without glancing at their mailboxes, afraid of what violation notice might be waiting. Kids played outside again. Neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now celebrated openly in their driveways. And the best moment came the day Mark's new wheelchair arrived. It was custom-built, perfectly fitted, smooth, quiet, powerful. A full replacement funded entirely by restitution. I watched him roll down the sidewalk for the first time, the sun on his face, the confidence back in his posture, and it struck me how deeply the HOA had tried to erase him. They didn't just take a chair, they tried to take his presence, his dignity, his right to exist visibly in his own community. But in the end, he was the one who erased them. Neighbors came by in small waves, offering handshakes, gratitude, sometimes even apologies for staying silent for so long. One woman hugged Mark tightly, thanking him for saving her home. Another man brought homemade dinner, saying he finally slept without anxiety for the first time in 2 years. It wasn't praise we were looking for, but it reminded us why the fight mattered. Late that night, I looked at the map again. Hundreds of red markers blinking across the country, each one a story waiting to be heard. Each one a neighbor facing the same kind of fear we had once lived with. And in that moment, I realized something with absolute clarity. We weren't done. "What do you think?" Mark asked, nodding toward the screen. I exhaled slowly. "I think we know exactly what to do next." We weren't homeowners anymore. Not just brothers defending our street. We had become something else. Investigators. Advocates. A warning to every corrupt HOA hiding behind bylaws and bureaucracy. People were reaching out because they finally had someone who understood. Someone who fought back. Someone who wouldn't stay silent. Someone who couldn't be intimidated. We packed our files. We organized our notes. We prepared for what came next. And as I turned off the lights and stepped out onto the quiet street we had fought so hard to save, I felt the truth settle inside me like a promise. Because now they know we're coming. I was sitting in Mark's living room the night everything finally settled, the glow of his laptop lighting the wall behind him. On the screen was a map of the United States covered in red markers, each one a complaint, a plea, or a story sent from homeowners across the country. Some were small communities. Some were massive developments. Some were managed by the very corporations we had helped expose. But they all had one thing in common. People were suffering, and no one had listened until now. It felt surreal to think this all started because two HOA contractors stole my brother's wheelchair. One criminal act in the dark had exposed an entire network of greed and corruption stretching far beyond our town. But for the first time, I felt something different rising beneath the exhaustion. Hope. Our neighborhood had changed. Completely. The court-appointed receiver worked faster than anyone expected. Refund checks went out to every homeowner who had been wrongfully fined. Stolen funds were returned. Blocks that had lived under fear for years were suddenly free. People walked their dogs without glancing at their mailboxes, afraid of what violation notice might be waiting. Kids played outside again. Neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now celebrated openly in their driveways. And the best moment came the day Mark's new wheelchair arrived. It was custom-built, perfectly fitted, smooth, quiet, powerful. A full replacement funded entirely by restitution. I watched him roll down the sidewalk for the first time. The sun on his face, the confidence back in his posture, and it struck me how deeply the HOA had tried to erase him. They didn't just take a chair. They tried to take his presence, his dignity, his right to exist visibly in his own community. But in the end, he was the one who erased them. Neighbors came by in small waves, offering handshakes, gratitude, sometimes even apologies for staying silent for so long. One woman hugged Mark tightly, thanking him for saving her home. Another man brought homemade dinner, saying he finally slept without anxiety for the first time in 2 years. It wasn't praise we were looking for, but it reminded us why the fight mattered. Late that night, I looked at the map again. Hundreds of red markers blinking across the country, each one a story waiting to be heard. Each one a neighbor facing the same kind of fear we had once lived with. And in that moment, realized something with absolute clarity. We weren't done. "What do you think?" Mark asked, nodding toward the screen. I exhaled slowly. I think we know exactly what to do next. We weren't homeowners anymore. Not just brothers defending our street. We had become something else. Investigators. Advocates. A warning to every corrupt HOA hiding behind bylaws and bureaucracy. People were reaching out because they finally had someone who understood, someone who fought back, someone who wouldn't stay silent, someone who couldn't be intimidated. We packed our files. We organized our notes. We prepared for what came next. And as I turned off the lights and stepped out onto the quiet street we had fought so hard to save, I felt the truth settle inside me like a promise. Because now they know we're coming.